Alright everyone, it's time for part one of a little sort of mini-series here that I'm doing in several parts on the topic of the current paradigm shift. Because I think some people are under so much social stress, like even if the political party they kind of like is in power, they still experience constant social alienation, partially because of concern trolling and shilling, the normal fare, partially because of the fact that we're undergoing a paradigm shift. So some people, against their better judgment, have actually been convinced that there's like enormous, unprecedented problems going on in our country or in the Western world in general that can't be overcome. I'm here to be the bearer of slightly more optimistic news with this little mini-series. For instance, there will be no ultimate white displacement. For those who care about that issue, it's not going to happen. You watch, you wait and see. So now I'll talk about part one here. Traditionalism inevitably winning the current shift because of growth and decline, specifically urban versus rural population demographics and things of that nature. Now here's the key. Within Western countries, developed nations, this is not necessarily the case everywhere in the world, but certainly within Western Europe, certainly within the US and Canada. If we're talking about left and right in the generally understood sense, now those have begun to break down and have less meaning, but we mean the pro-globalist, pro-multicultural, anti-Second Amendment sort of forces, combined with the open borders sort of spiel that happens in politics. If we're defining that roughly as what makes up the bulk of the left, and the right, so-called, again, neocons aside, the right as being generally the opposite of that in a rough fashion. Cities. Urban centers have a tendency to be those that are furthest to the left. Rural areas and smaller towns tend to be further to the right. The more rural it is, the more right-wing it tends to be. Not 100% the case. You can get a rural community that's like, for partisan, we're not talking about partisan reasons, because there can be some like old Southern Democrat rural community in Dixieland that's like solid Democrat, at the state level at least, and it's a partisan thing. It has nothing to do with ideology. It has to do with long-standing, almost feudalistic political loyalty. The same way you can get a city that's marginally Republican. That can certainly happen. You can think of some of the areas within Los Angeles that actually go red from time to time. And we're not even talking about affluent suburbs. We're talking about essentially marginal inner city when this happens. Urban centers tend to be the furthest left. Rural areas tend to be the most conservative. What do we see as in regards to demographics? What is a city? In cities, people who are native tend to breed less, generally speaking. People in smaller towns, rural communities, some of the smaller cities, breed more quickly. Now, when we're talking about population growth in this sense, we have to at the same time exclude immigration. That debate is ultimately separate. Because those people are not experiencing the same biological effects from birth as people who are born within the culture. It also transcends race. It has nothing to do with that. I understand that it overlaps with demographics quite ably, but that is a semi-separate issue when we're talking just about political ideology and affiliation here. What I see happening over time is that as inner city populations tend to breed more slowly, certain cities off the coast go into decay and people gravitate away from them. You end up with the growth of smaller communities to a reasonable degree. Rural areas, they remain roughly stable, but people tend to have larger families in general. Religious communities as well often have larger families. You would think of Mormon families, typically more children than most other groups. Some Southern Baptist group, more children maybe than a Methodist family or a Catholic family from inner city Boston. Over time, this stabilizes demographics. When people say, well, we're moving inevitably to the left, there's nothing that can stop it, the United States will eventually be fully blue. This was already predicted some time ago, to the point at which the last election, the results that we saw, if they were only based on that apparently stable trend that people point to when they have these views. If that were true, then this last election should never have happened, because there were areas that supposedly had been on that steady march towards blueness, or towards liberalism in a general sense that went red. Sometimes there was a movement of 10, 15 points over the last couple of elections. Now, how can this be if demographics move in one direction forever? Well, it can't be. But that's because demographics don't move in one direction forever. They're sporadic. Party platforms change. Aspects of ideology within even ideological movements can change. Happens all the time. Religious demographics change. Racial demographics change. Everything changes. There is no such thing as stability within politics. It doesn't happen. As the inner cities continue to contract, more and more blight, partially because of globalism. And as rural, small town, and disenfranchised former city communities all amalgamate together under what would eventually, I think, become a true labor platform, this will defeat the globalists. It will defeat liberalism. Because those smaller communities will continue to grow. They will gain more dominance in certain forms of voting. The switch in the West towards urbanization, I think, at some point reverses. When it does, this does not mean that a bunch of inner-city liberal individuals go off to indoctrinate small-town America or small-town France or something. No, what this actually means is that those that are marginal within those communities, people who are marginalized, they're under more stress, tend to be the ones that move around more. Oh, I lost my job. Well, it's time to move. I need to take up a job elsewhere. I don't feel welcome in my community. I need to find a community I feel more welcome in. So, since the movement generally is going to be away from urbanization with time, as cities get more miserable and less efficient, because of that, who's going to be moving to those zones? Again, people who are maybe further right, more traditionalistic in their views within a culture. Maybe pan-Western in a nationalistic sense, something that's a civic nationalist, ethno-nationalistic. People who want to return to the land, some neo-pastoralist movement you could think of. And this will buffer up the smaller towns and the rural communities even more. Over time as well, as more land is exploited, the native population still would have room to grow. This can't happen in Western Europe to any great extent. It certainly can here in the United States. We have to think about striking a balance with that, by the way. The inner cities will not be breeding as much. People will be moving out of them. I can see a future in which a lot of these mega cities decline back to a more stable level. That will cause them to lose some political influence. Now, you'll always have some true metropolitan areas that are retained, whether they're particularly efficient or not. For instance, New York City is, at this point, with its size, is no longer as efficient as it could be. But it's propped up by tax money from the rest of upstate New York as well as the federal government. It also happens to be a major port of call. There's a lot of tourism. It will be retained. But what about, what about Boston? What about Philadelphia? What about Detroit? Detroit's already gone into decline. We see what happens. Then you have to clean up the mess that's left behind. But over time, the urban area can lose power. I believe in the future, we're talking over the next 20 or 30 years, there will be a steady shift away from people wanting to live in cities. This will mean a larger suburban population and urban sprawl, unfortunately. But it will also mean a larger small town and rural population. Especially, you've got to understand something. Some of the infrastructural problems that plagued small town America maybe 20 years ago are no longer present. Most small towns are ably hooked up now to the World Wide Web. People can talk to people in the outside world. They can do e-commerce and all of these other things. Could they do that even a half decade ago reliably? In some areas, the answer is no. It wasn't until about that period of time, for instance, that the Northeast Kingdom here in Vermont moved past having dial-up internet. They finally have broadband now. That would not have been a great place, thus, to do that kind of business. Are you going to do a teleconference with your boss, call into work? No, I don't think you are. Are you going to work from home? Are you going to be self-employed? If I had been living in the Northeast Kingdom, would I have been able to do the things that I do that are making me money, that are allowing me to be self-employed? No, I don't think so. There are a handful of communities that are still kind of like that, but for the most part, it's all fleshed out. You've got your cell phone coverage. You've got your internet access. You've got all of the things necessary for that community to survive. Small town America is looking more and more attractive, I think, to people who feel marginalized within cities. Another problem, demographic replacement within cities. sometimes can alienate people based on race or ethnicity, forcing them out to the suburbs, which is what used to happen, or increasingly, I think, to small towns and rural areas as well. I think, as well, we will finally tackle the immigration issue. Once enough social stress builds up, it's inevitable. It's just a matter of at what point do we hit that. Right now, perhaps we're not quite there. I'm beginning to think that it's possible that Molyneux is right, that Trump will sort of do a cop-out on immigration. I'm still optimistic enough to hope that doesn't happen. But if it does, it will only increase social stress. See, it's almost a no-lose situation. Hear me out here. If reform happens, you've solved the problem. If reform doesn't happen, more and more people feel alienated, and more people vote for people who will hopefully solve the problem. It's just a matter of how hard-line do the politicians getting elected become before the problem actually is solved in a political sense. That's the only real issue. I don't see any grand decline of the United States. I think in the long term, traditionalism does win. My only hope is that it doesn't immediately turn around and become as abusive as multiculturalism and globalism have become. That it doesn't become like the neoliberals. If it does, it too will fall in time. We still have options for permanently preserving political and social stability within the United States. You need to take a dash of personal liberty, a dash of populist reform, and just a wee bit of social progressivism, mix them all together, and you, I think, have a winning recipe. The problem is that because of the politically stagnated environment that we're in, because of the partisan problems that we have, difficult to do. Trump, I think, honestly, is trying his best because he's no far-righter. Can we be honest here? He's not like a Tea Partier. He's ultimately a business Democrat. He's walking that thin populistic line. He's also calling everyone else under the sun that he ever insults. He's like, oh, worst person ever. You're creepy. You're degenerated. You're, crazy Hillary or whatever. With Rand Paul, the marginal libertarian of the GOP, he's like, oh, yeah, Rand is like a great friend to me. I admire him deeply, but he's standing in the way of healthcare reform. It's slightly odd that he didn't go whole hog and just lambaste him. It's actually slightly strange. I think he intends to work with him more in the future. But the current cultural shift is away from globalism and liberalism anyway. People who stand for neoliberalism are on their way out. It's just a matter of do we become more socially progressive as a far-left element rises up, and so what form does it take? Is it like a crazy Marxist movement, or is it more like a JFK-style revivalism? More likely, though, I think, the right ends up winning out. My hope is that they don't immediately become like a theocratic movement or something. Because, I mean, that would screw me as much as like the globalism side does. In a social sense, internally within the country itself, it'd be harder times for people like me who do not fully endorse that sort of traditionalistic platform. I have many traditionalistic views, more than generally people would talk about at this point on social media. But that doesn't mean that I hate gay people, or it doesn't mean that I hate other races. Some people get to that level, and if they're the ones that prevail, well, then you have maybe a little bit of a problem. Economically speaking, too, we see already Trump's mild reform has been taken the wrong way by Western Europe, and now there are fewer tourists that come to the U.S. from here and from Latin America. But I wouldn't be too worried. Demographics can solve all sorts of things. There have been times in human history where groups of people have been abused, marginalized, and displaced, and they rise back up and become an empire or something. So don't worry too much. You should work towards your goals. You should definitely work towards debilitating the lying legacy media. You should definitely work towards trying to help clear out the establishment within D.C. You should certainly be prepared to preserve yourself if need be. Like, you shouldn't sit by and watch the Second Amendment get eroded or something like that. That's clear. Stand for your values and simply stand in general. Don't, kneel down before other people with shitty ideas. But you don't need to get so panicky and so paranoid that you become so demoralized. You're like, oh, we'll never win. Liberalism is here forever. We're going to be like worshiping Marx soon. What the hell kind of point does that make? Well, then you've already been defeated. So, what's the point, essentially? That's about all. Peace out.